Good morning, everyone, or I should say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone calling in here for this exciting webinar that we're going to conduct today that deals with lessons learned and challenges in doing oncology studies in Asia Pacific. Today's case study is being done on a global phase 3 multi-site, multi-country colorectal trial that was done in APAC for a EU pharma company where they were using the data from this study for filings and submission to both the FDA and to the EMEA. Next slide, please. I'd like first to introduce the people on the call here. The first person is Dr. Christophe Tournerie, who is a physician and founder and CEO of ClinActis. And he has more than 15 years in Asia Pacific of doing clinical trials. He was originally trained as an MD in infectious disease. It's a specialty in France. And his first position was with Sanofi. Sanofi then, after several years, sent him to Asia Pacific, where he opened up their clinical operations in Japan and in China and in India. After several years, he moved over to Parexel, a global CRO, to help open their Asian operations for clinical research. And then finally, before starting ClinActis, he worked for PharmaNet Inventive Health. At PharmaNet, he did, I thought, a tremendous thing in bringing in very quality people. His philosophy with ClinActis was to make it basically a Western CRO, and that a Western CRO that does practice in the East or in Asia. So we found that as a very strong complement to the way clinical trials need to be conducted according to ICH GCP guidelines. The second thing he did was he brought in Paul Lim, who is director of clinical research, who has a degree in clinical pharmacy and an expert in phase 1 studies. He has about 15 years of experience in Asia Pacific, beginning as a CRA and working his way up to all the way to be the head of clinical operations. His last position was with Bristol Myers Squibb, running their Asia Pacific clinical operations and having an extraordinary amount of oncology experience. Finally, myself, Bill Van Ostren, I am the head of North America Business Development. I'm going to give this presentation today. We'll open this up to questions and answers at the end of the program, and then we will send out copies of this presentation to all those that attended the program today. So next slide, please. The first thing we want to do is just give a little bit of background experience of ClinActis and oncology studies over the last several years. As you can see here, there's a wide divergence of experience, everything from phase 1 to phase 3, from doing it at one site to doing it to over 45 sites, and doing it from one country all the way up to 7 countries. Most of the work that we did in these studies were for EU pharma companies or US biotech companies. Recently, two major American pharma companies have signed agreement with us to be their FSP, functional service provider, in Asia Pac for oncology, which we're very excited about. We're here to talk about the colorectal double-blind phase 3 study today, which we'll talk further about in the next slide. As you can see here, this was a global randomized double-blind controlled phase 3 study. The enrollment duration was to take place over 2 years. The study actually involved 34 countries, 165 sites from the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. The total study requirement target was 550 patients, and our responsibility, ClinActis, was just for Asia Pacific. Next slide. How did we do with accelerating study startup, which was actually critical as part of this case study and one of the reasons we wanted to share this information with the people on the phone today. Next slide. As you can see with this slide here, so we are working as part of a global trial. So we had one portion of that. But what was very interesting is that we had study startup and first patient enrolled anywhere from a year, in some cases, ahead of Europe and 2 years ahead of the United States because of the study still pending of not getting it through the Food and Drug Administration at this state. I think the ultimate compliment to us is that we have already been given a second phase 3 portion for the same type of study with a different objective and clinical endpoint from the EU pharma company. Next slide. As you can see in that previous slide, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Hong Kong achieved first patient recruitment 8 weeks ahead after the sites were approved or activated. And in the Philippines, it was just 6 weeks. As I mentioned before, if you compared that to Europe, it was 1 year ahead of them, and the US approvals are still ongoing. Next slide. What were our recruitment strategies? Next slide. As we know, in Asia Pac, they have a much larger population to draw from. The growth of population in Asia is running at about 13 to 17% per annum, where in the United States and Europe it's running 3 to 4%. So all immediately you have a much greater population to choose from. You also have a lot of naive patients and very specific sick patients who need and want treatment because of the various health reimbursement programs are not as, let's say, robust as they are in the United States and Europe. So they look forward to potentially participating in clinical trials such as this. I mean, we needed to do certain things as far as starting this project up. First was to have a precise definition of patient populations, and there's great databases to draw from at each of our sites. We needed to have specific tumor characteristics during the initial phase, which was key to ensuring enrollment success. We had biweekly phone calls to support the site recruitment. We supported sites in pre-screening activities with specialists, medical oncology monitors, to discuss the actual patient case with the sponsor to confirm patient's eligibility. Critical to provide both the inclusion and exclusion checklists to ease the screening process. We prepared physician referrals and patient education programs, and we ran newsletters and monthly recruitment status to maintain investigators' interest. We also did a lot of face-to-face because one of the things that we felt was crucial was that our CRCs have personal relationships with the site CRCs and the PIs over a long period of time, which help engender trust and build a relationship and give them confidence in working with them. Next slide. Some of the other recruitment strategies, as I mentioned before, we have oncology medical monitors that work closely with each site to explain and communicate precisely the definition of the patient population, especially the rationale and the differences between CT scans. It's really the standard of care versus investigational requirements. They have to be carefully explained. In some countries, as I mentioned, the sponsor is required to pay for the comparator and the co-administrative drugs to support the clinical trial. We needed to create a dialogue with the investigators so we could get opinions from them on the compound so we could share that with our sponsors to anticipate questions. And finally, we had to train investigators and CRCs on the informed consent process, which is critical as part of IRB approvals. Next slide. I just want to show this slide very quickly because what it basically states is that we had double the randomizations by sites for this study, which showed that our accelerated study startup worked very, very well. Next slide. We have an extensive relationship-based site list. So next slide, I will discuss that. In Asia Pac, Dr. Tournerie has been able over 15 years to develop a group of 82 what I call ICH GCP compliant oncology sites. These sites have PIs. Most of them are US trained, came out of medical schools, UCLA, Duke, Hopkins, and others here in the United States to go back and practice in Asia Pac, wherever they may be. And while in the United States, they participated in many types of studies for NCI and NIH, other related investigative organizations and pharmaceutical companies. So this list of sites here is all ICH GCP compliant, all have PIs with backgrounds of doing clinical research that would be acceptable to both the FDA and the EMEA. Next slide. You have to have knowledge of the IRB process, which is very important in Asia Pac. Next slide. In most countries in Asia, we can perform IRB and regulatory submissions in parallel. In the United States, you have to do these things sequentially. So you have to get health authority approval first in the US and Europe, and then you can submit to the IRB. But in Asia, these things are done in parallel. Most of the IRB applications involve multiple step review process. Okay. The initial application package will be screening of an IRB. And we do that in the United States. We do send, as an example, a synopsis to the United States to an IRB so that we can use that as a preparatory meeting to anticipate the questions are going to be asked and the holes we may have in our application for the formal IRB approval. In Asia, they do this as standard operating procedure. During the initial IRB submission, we need to clearly define the endpoints so as to evaluate the safety and efficacy of the investigational drugs of the predefined protocol in the application form. The IRBs are very focused about the description of the study endpoints, as I mentioned above, in order to grant the approval of the study protocol. Next slide. Next slide, please. In addition, the IRBs will also consider some other critical factors of their review process. It's really about the completeness of the clinical data, the justification of the placebo use, the study design and recruitment procedures. We have to make sure the selection is equitable. The consent process must be adequate information to prospective subjects so that the subjects can make an informed decision regarding the participation in this particular research activity. We need to define the benefits versus the risk of participating and the types of side effects that can be expected or one may experience. Finally, the payment terms need to be addressed for the experimental treatment and where those reimbursements are going to come from. Next slide. We have to have knowledge of the site contract process. Next slide. To me, this is really one of the critical areas and shows why we're able to get study startup 90 to 120 days ahead of other CROs, global CROs, pharma companies, or biotech companies attempting to do this themselves in Asia. And ClinActis has a full knowledge of the contract process of each hospital in Asia Pacific that it's garnered over the 15 years. We've been able to build a library with all the site contract templates for the signing of the contract. We have already to use hospital standard contract templates for each site at all our major institutions that were listed in the 82 sites of the previous slide, based on our previous clinical trial experience. You can't put a time figure on that and the importance, because one of the major delays in the United States is doing a phase 3 study with 20 sites and have 20 different contract templates, 20 different IRB approval timeframes, which lead to significant delays in study startup. We can shorten the legal review timeframe by 2 to 3 months if we opt to use the hospital standard template, as I've mentioned before. We will need to use the local laws of the governing law in the clinical trial contracts. So local laws are very important as part of the governing law in those contracts. The structure and payment mode of the contract and budget vary from hospital and from country to country. Next slide. It's also important to note that in most of the Asian countries, when you're negotiating these contracts with the hospitals or teams, one of the things that they're looking for is very, very important to them is regarding the high risk issues such as subject injury, indemnification, confidentiality, ownership of the data, the patent rights, and publication rights. So these are the critical things that are contained in those contracts and those templates, and that's why it's important to have that information in advance. Hospital and principal investigators cannot and will not accept the financial responsibility or damages due to injury as part of participating in any study. IRB approval is required in order to submit the proposed budget during the initial submission in most countries. Contract and budget negotiations need to start much earlier before the submission to the HA. Some principal investigators require advance payments from the sponsor before they even start the study. So we have to know that by site, by country, by PI. And then some hospital contracts need to be signed in a local language. As an example, in Taiwan, all contracts need to be translated traditional Chinese for signing. In Indonesia, bilingual contract containing both English and Indonesian language will be signed by the sites. Next slide. We have to have knowledge of the regulatory submission and approval time by country. Next slide. Our CRA teams are very, very experienced. And what's different in Asia than from the United States is that the CRAs, in particular companies such as us, have relationships with not only with the sites, but they have relationships with the regulatory bodies that they can pick up the phone and they talk to these people by first name and are able to negotiate the contracts, the approvals, the timeframes that can be expected as a result of the data submission. If the data submission is incomplete, they're going to advise us in advance. So as we approach that final submission, we know exactly by the library we built, by country, by regulatory authority, what is required. Next slide. This is just an example of the process for timelines by country in Asia. So we have the 7 countries that participated here, and you can see they were all parallel. The one that was not, and this is a mistype down below, was Thailand, where it was sequential, 3 to 4 months for EC approval and 3 to 4 months for RA approval. But the rest were parallel, which saved us an enormous period of time. Next slide. We have to have the complete knowledge of the custom requirements and drug shipment logistics. Next slide. Customs requirements, are critical, and we have to have the proper regulatory documents for importation of IMPs, which includes the clinical trial certificate of the CTC and the import license, which is the IL. Apart from the regulatory documents, shipment documents must be presented for clearance to take place. These documents include the customs invoice, copy of the airway bill, the packing list, certificate of analysis, the clinical trial approval, which comes with the consignee, together with a copy of their business license. All shippers need to ensure custom invoices of IMPs to meet local requirements. There are many requirements for custom invoices, including the shipper and consignee name, the consignee's name, the address, the content details, the shipment commodity description, country of origin, expiration date, batch number, manufacturer company name, and shipper company name. Every single one of these must match the same details on the inner packaging label of these packages. Any discrepancies can lead to delays in customs due to the inspection by local authorities. Critical is selecting the right and certified recorder, or IOR. Next slide. We have requirement of the lab exporting logistics. Next slide. Ensure we have applied and obtained lab kits import license in the country according to the local medical device regulations. The central lab needs to provide a complete list of lab information for the application of the import license. The list must specify the type of lab kits to be imported, the quantity of kits, its manufacturing company of origination, the batch numbers, as well as expiration date for the lab kits. There are local requirements in some countries with regards to exportation of clinical trial blood labs. As an example, in Taiwan, we will need to obtain the lab sample export license from the Taiwan FDA. If you go down to countries like Korea, experience shows difficulties in exporting a certain type of blood samples for genetic testing to other countries. The sponsor may actually need to speak to relevant authorities for special permission. Next slide. We have to have knowledge of cost variations by country. Next slide. For highly developed countries like Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong, the cost of conducting a clinical trial is approximately 2 to 3 times higher than that of Taiwan, and 4 to 5 times higher as compared to developing countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Clinical trial costs are higher in developed countries compared to developing countries due to higher investigator costs, significant competition from pharmaceutical companies, higher administrative costs, higher costs to maintain infrastructure at the hospitals, and engagement of professional teams to improve regulatory review. It's really the cost of getting higher quality work. The sponsors need to pay and include the cost of all comparator drugs because insurance companies will not pay for these drugs during the trial. Some hospitalization, post-surgery hospitalization costs may also need to be covered. As an example, most patients staying in a rural area in Philippines would be reimbursed for higher transportation fees due to long distance traveling to city center to participate in the trials. Monitoring experience and years of experience of our RBMs. Next slide. ClinActis has one of the key things that Dr. Tournerie did as well is make sure that he found CRCs on the ground in each country, CRAs on the ground in each country, who were ICH GCP certified that have previously worked for either pharma companies or CROs. Our CRAs, especially in the oncology area, average over 5 years of experience. They have to have a strong project management team in addition with many years of conducting oncology trials. And the reason it is because the language associated with oncology trials is significantly different than language and terminologies of other trials. And the oncology people get very frustrated if our oncology CRAs and project managers don't understand that specific language around that specific indication within oncology trials. We have an expert team of medical monitors or oncology medical monitors who specifically trained in oncology, as I mentioned, will work with investigator centers to ensure the studies are conducted in accordance with the protocol, the standard operating procedures, and ICH GCP guidelines. All our monitors and nursing medical graduates understand the complexities of oncology trials in those study centers. Our monitors have an in-depth understanding of study protocols, and they're able to interact appropriate staff to make effective interventions and ensure smooth study progress through initiation. Experience to conduct a source data verification based on risk-based monitoring, where our CRA is focusing on verifying critical data that are related to patient and data quality and provide constructive instructions for the site to resolve the issues. They're able to manage the complexities and the incidence of AEs and SCEs that are part of monitoring clinical trials in oncology. Utilize common terminology criteria for adverse events. Describe the common challenges of monitoring and monitoring patient revisit schedules due to AEs. We have to look at dose reduction, early termination rule for safety purposes. The CRAs need to apply rules and techniques to overcome them. Next slide. What are the ROIs for participating in studies in this region? We found out that they're very cost effective to run trials in Asia. And we know that's 30 to 40% less than the US and European countries, specifically the oncologic area. In Asia, we have a huge, large treatment of naive patient population and pools for oncology subjects that are willing to participate, more than willing to participate. We have large treatment naive patient pools in Asia because of the low healthcare expenditures. So Asia is not spending a lot of money in oncology, and they're looking for the opportunity of participating in these studies. We have to have the capabilities and expertise. In Asia, we have well-trained, knowledgeable oncologists and key opinion leaders, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, many of whom were trained in the United States. But the most important thing, the sites that we have chosen, the data derived from those studies is acceptable to the Food and Drug Administration and the EMEA. Because again, those KOLs, those PIs were trained in the United States and understand the ICH GCP compliant regulations. According to the latest announcement, the CFDA, that's the China Food and Drug Administration, that is on October 17, 2017, they produced or put forth new guidance accepting data from outside sources. There's a key to that, though, or an and or a but. Those accepted of outside data sources only comes from 6 sites, 4 in Taiwan and 2 in Hong Kong that have been pre-approved by the CFDA because of the closeness to ethnicity as far as the CFDA is concerned, and that those sites have been certified not only to conduct the trials, early development, which is mostly the PK, PD, BEBA, and SAD-MAD studies, a part of phase 1. But they also approve PK labs, okay, that are associated with those hospitals that are acceptable to the CFDA. So that's critical as part of the new findings in China, and that we are well versed with those sites that they are pre-approved and have been very successful in conducting those trials and submissions. Thanks. Next slide. What are the lessons learned? I mean, we have a series of hurdles that we've had to deal with. We've had a set of challenges that we've had to deal with, and then we've had lessons learned. So there's 6 altogether. Let's talk about the first one. The hurdles to obtain regulatory IRB and both HA approval. The problem has been lack of adequate information for the submission dossier will delay approvals from any regulatory body. For oncology studies specifically, the IRB is focused on checking the clinical and non-clinical data and endpoints to look at safety versus risk. The lessons learned is we need to ensure that there's completeness of the clinical and non-clinical data submitted to the regulatory boards. That's why we have a database and a library of what exactly needs to be submitted. So we're able to save that 90 to 120 days in study startup. These include, but they're not limited to, a list of all AE incidences from mild to moderate to severe, a listing of all the safety data from both the clinical and the animal studies, an analysis of any mortality instances observed in either the animal or clinical studies, a detailed description of the risk versus the benefits for subjects participating, and full justification of placebo use and selection of doses based on analyzed scientific data. Next slide. The second challenge here is the lengthy contract negotiation process. So the challenge we face, or companies face, is that the structure of the contract template in deferred payment mode can vary from hospital to hospital, country to country. And it's governed by the receiving hospital policies of countries, regulatory requirements, and arbitration laws. The negotiation of differing regulations between sponsors and sites can be time consuming. We know that from experience in the United States. So what do? We obviously go back to our library again, where for these 82 sites, we have all the templates existing. We know what's approved. We know how to speed up the process. It is advisable to share the hospital's contract template with the sponsor in advance for review during the initial process of site selection. We share and explain the compromised legal terms with the sponsors based on our experiences in negotiating with the legal departments of the various hospitals and sponsors from different studies and countries. The sites are required in most Asian countries to facilitate in shortening the contract and budget review and discussing timelines. It is helpful in clarifying any doubts with the site staffs. Number 3, insufficient site study budget to conduct the study. We're worried about the delay of study startup fees can affect initial recruitment. Insufficient funding will affect the recruitment process, reduced investigators' motivation. We know this because this happens in the US and Europe all the time. So we need to clearly understand the structure of the research fund in different institutions. That's why our library, going back to the library again, is so critical. We need to ensure startup fees that are paid as soon as the contract has been executed. We need to determine the details of the payment, such as the payment terms. When are they going to be paid? What's it going to be based on? What are the milestones? Okay. And the different assessments and labs and images. Next slide. 4, lack of motivation. Lack of proper information provided to the sites will affect the activities. Lack of confidence in recruiting patients by the site. Lack of judgment in screening eligibility. Loss of motivation recruitment based due to the assumed complexity of selection criteria. So again, it's not knowing what that exact inclusion and exclusion criteria is. It is preferable to have an investigator meeting before to ensure all PIs, CRCs, and site team members have the same knowledge and understanding. This allows the study to be conducted in a standardized manner in activities such as selection of patients, study procedure, and what the data capture is going to be, by paper or by EDC. We have to develop the standard operating procedures for each study visit for all assessments. The SOPs can include worksheets to assist the AE, reporting, advises on medical information use, and set up flow charts to assist the staff by step-by-step instructions, and they can be wall charts for them. Thank you. Next slide. Number 5, we have to face the restrictions that are based on shipping samples to overseas labs. So these are all involving logistics. Our clinical supply chain vendor is unable to deliver blood sample to central lab in US and Europe within a stipulated 48 hours. Another challenge is prolonged shipment of blood samples may observe cell lysis, where the analysis of these blood samples will result in unreliable data. So how do we deal with that? It is preferable to opt for a reputable supply chain vendor who was able to deliver samples to the central labs located in the US and EU from Asia. We know that information. We have that list in our library of the LabCorps of the world, of the Eurofin of the world, the people that we work with for many, many years, where we know they're not going to make mistakes. Alternatively, the sponsor considers selecting a central lab based in Asia. We have that list, okay, as well. Finally, the sponsor can consider preparing backup plans to use a local lab perform blood samples. That was what I was mentioning before in terms of the CFDA. They have local labs approved with those 6 sites in Taiwan and Hong Kong. Number 6, wrong or delay in data entry can affect timelines involving database lock. So the challenge is data entry can be delayed due to the site's busy schedule, use of unsuitable medical terms to report AE and SAE in the ECRF, where revision is needed causing delay, technical issues delaying data entry process by the site, and of course the discrepancies in data encountered compared to the source, or entered compared to the source data. I mean, a lot of this happens too when you deal with things like amendments, so we have to be very careful in dealing with amendments. What are the lessons learned? The lessons learned is that we need to provide the ECRF manual detailing the standardized processes and procedures to enter the data. Provide a list of medical terms for common AE reporting in oncology trials, specific to oncology trials. Provide proper instructions for reporting medical events. Report the diagnosis of event rather than the symptoms. Share outstanding queries by data management on a regular basis. A lot of that can be done on the phone. A lot of that is taken care of with electronic data capture because you can see that information versus having to go physically visit the site and find the query, right? And we need to perform site visits specifically then to resolve data queries. Next. So what are some of the key results that have come out of this case study? Most of the submissions to the IRB and the health authorities were completed ahead of schedule, at least 90 to 120 days, and in some cases a year ahead of Europe and 2 years ahead of the US. We were the first global enrollment was from Asia, ClinActis doing that. We had the first patient was screened in Malaysia in January of 2014, and the first randomized in January of 14. Good teamwork, good communication, good coordination with the stakeholders are important to patient recruitment. But to me, still the critical thing is the relationships our CRAs, medical monitors, and PMs have with the sites themselves. So why ClinActis? I mean, to us, having local knowledge is having local execution. It's very difficult to manage a study from the United States or Europe in Asia, or to hire local people that don't have long-term experience with those individual sites and relationships with those sites as we do. We have the most experienced team in Asia. Management has over 25 years of doing clinical trials in all the countries of Asia. Our CRAs average 10 plus years in many of the countries, and our CRAs are all on the ground in those countries. Our clinical operations managers have an average of 13 years. We have a deep domain knowledge of the sites, the contracts, the CRCs, the principal investigators, and the logistics for both sending and receiving medicine and sending and receiving labs. We have a trusted relationship on first name basis with the health authorities. And as I stated earlier on in the presentation, we have 82 plus ICH GCP compliant oncology sites where most of those people have been trained in the US and Europe, and their data has been accepted by both the FDA and the EMEA. They've been audited by those organizations and the health authorities within their own countries. So they understand this process. And I think that's the critical aspects of working with something like us and why this case study is important and why we were so successful. Next slide. We'd like to thank you for participating. Please send any questions that you may have to our website, and we will get back to you within a short period of time of answering that questions. And then finally, we will make a video and audio portion of this presentation to send out to all of you today. Again, thank you for taking the time of joining us. Good evening, good night, good morning.